Welcome back to Open Book with PG. I am PG, and this is my beautiful wife, Piper. We're continuing our Meet the Apostles series today. So last episode, we talked about Andrew, Peter. Oh, and who's the third one? Matthew, our tax collectors and fishermen. And kind of as a launching point, we're actually only going to cover two today. We're going to cover Peter kind of again, just because he kind of relates to the two we're going to be talking about today, and we'll kind of hit on Andrew like very briefly too in this, and then we'll also hit on technically not an original 12, but a disciple, not an apostle necessarily, as well. And so we're talking about James and John. So they were brothers. They also get the nickname later on Sons of Thunder, which is, I mean, like, if we're talking nicknames, like, I mean, them, and then John and being the beloved disciple, the one that Jesus loved, like, and then you get Doubting Thomas. But like,
it's better than Doubting Thomas.
but like, they're up there. I mean, and Peter's up there pretty, like, The Rock, right?
That's
like, he's definitely giving a run for his money. But Sons of Thunder, I mean, for at least for siblings, like this nickname, like that is up there. Like, I strive for that.
Well, and there's Son of Encouragement, which is Barnabas.
Yeah.
That was cool too.
Sons of Thunder. I mean, like, I'm just saying. But they get this nickname, and they are both sons of Zebedee. So here's kind of some of the crossover here. So obviously they were both fishermen. So they were fishermen. Peter and Andrew were fishermen. Zebedee was like a really, really successful fisherman in Galilee. So he was fishing the seas there. Do you remember where Peter and Andrew were fishermen? Galilee. And so more than likely, because Zebedee wasn't just running one fishing boat. He was running a fishing business in Galilee. More than likely, Peter and Andrew were fishermen for Zebedee. They probably did not have their own side business. They were probably just working with him. And so that's really interesting. It's like, man, the day that Jesus came to the Sea of Galilee and just took away all of those people, like, I imagine Zebedee's like, okay, took my sons and another one of my boats
and their partners,
and like, okay, I can only imagine the conversation. I mean, like, I understand obviously with the context and culture of being a disciple and those type of things, especially to Jesus was a pretty respected rabbi amongst the people, just not so much in the Pharisees and Sadducees, but amongst the people until the end, and we all know what happens there. But he was fairly respected to start out with, and so I imagine there wasn't too much of a struggle there, them being able to be a called disciple of Jesus. But there is that part of me that goes, man, like, somebody's just sitting there, just like, man, why? like, why Galilee? And they also make it called in kind of an interesting way, where Jesus is like, hey guys, let's go out in this boat. And then they do such a good job at rowing him out in this boat.
Excuse me.
Wow.
Nice. I'm so
sorry. Jesus preaches like the most fire sermon of his entire life. He's like, man, you guys did a really good job at rowing that boat. You know what you would also be really good at? Joining my internship. It's 3 years of the most grueling labor possible. We're not going to have a place to sleep. And you kind of have to pay your own way or just eat whatever scraps are left over. Sound good?
And you still have to pay your taxes.
And you still have to pay your taxes. This is not a tax write-off. You don't get any of the educational requirements to receive a degree at the end of this. But there will be tongues of fire. So, ultimately they end up coming, which is this really interesting way of happening. But similar backgrounds, and so if you don't understand what fishermen are, go back to episode 1. We don't need to spend a bunch of time explaining what fishermen were. We already talked about that last one. So what are some of the differences between James and John in comparison to Peter, and then some of the overlapping that ends up happening? Go for it.
Everybody take that? Okay.
Yeah.
So their overlap, as we kind of touched on briefly here, they were, Peter and Andrew were referred to as the partners of James and John. So in that story that Pastor Gregory just mentioned, which takes place in Luke chapter 5. Luke tells us that Jesus goes over to where they're fishing. He asks to get in Peter's boat and asks for Peter to row him out onto the lake, which kind of served as like a giant megaphone speaker system back in the day, because a crowd was already following him to listen to him preach. So he asks Peter to take him out onto the lake so he can preach, and then when he's done, they come back in and he calls them, asks them to be his disciples. And then Peter is actually the one who grabs James and John and brings them with him and Andrew to go follow Jesus. So it's a really cool little story there. Very non-traditional in how we tend to think of people being called into ministry today. Like there were no fog machines. There was no like uber spiritual, altar moments or anything like that. It was very calm and nonchalant, but ultimately it ended up changing the course of these four guys' lives for
eternity.
Yeah, for eternity, and they impacted eternity with the gospel and for the kingdom because of it. So just a really cool little moment, seemingly inconsequential moment that ended up having a huge impact. But some of the differences between them, obviously we talked about how Peter is a little bit rash. He kind of has a hard time bridling his tongue, you could say. Yeah. He's a little bit kind of off the cuff. He doesn't really have a lot of social skills, you could say.
He was a typical fisherman.
He was a very typical fisherman, yes. And James and John, they're a little more covert, at least at the beginning. They don't get themselves into a lot of trouble so far throughout Jesus' ministry. There are a couple times where, like one time they're going into a Samaritan village and the Samaritans reject Jesus. Mm-hmm. And James and John ask Jesus, can we call down fire from heaven to destroy this village? Yeah. And Jesus rebukes them and is like, no, if, like we talked about last time, Jesus didn't concern himself with lukewarm people. So he just says, if people aren't going to accept me, then we just leave. Like, we're not going to try to argue with them. We're not going to try to change their mind. We're just going to move on.
And we're not going to punish them either.
And we're not going to punish them either. Yeah, exactly. So they have less dramatic, I would say, kind of moments with Jesus throughout his ministry, but they do still have some very interesting ones. Mm-hmm. Like, they're the ones who get caught arguing over who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, and their mom asks Jesus, let my son sit one on your right hand and one on your left hand in the kingdom. And that leads Jesus into a lot of his discussions with his disciples about authority and leadership actually being a place of greater servitude.
Yeah. But think about, like, you can draw pretty easy conclusions from these when you think about their context beforehand. Mm-hmm. While James and John, yes, were fishermen, and so were Peter and Andrew. Peter and Andrew, for lack of better terms, were hired hands. Yeah. They didn't own a piece of the business. Yeah. They were merely employees. They were W-2'd from Zebedee's business, while James and John were set to inherit the business. They were the ones that were going to end up. So if you think about this, and the family dynamics, when James and John's mother's talking to him about these type of things, like they're used to inheritance, nice things. Like that was something that was continually. Now everybody in that time kind of understood how inheritance works, but inheritance was sometimes, hey, here's this rusty old shack type thing, versus, hey, here's my business. Yeah. Here is everything you'll ever need for your life. And they would work in that. Like for James and John, what they decided to give up to go do that, one, it somewhat seems as if they had family support. Mm-hmm. Which nowadays in a more family-oriented society would be kind of tough. You wouldn't necessarily always have that. But it sounds like they did. And that would still be kind of weird. Yeah. Because usually you did whatever your family did. Unless your family was so poor that you needed to do something to get a leg up. This was not the case for James and John. And James and John were set to inherit a huge, huge inheritance that would have been great. Zebedee was very well known, hence why his name is in the Bible. Hence why you get to whether they're known as sons of Zebedee. If Zebedee wasn't something in that society or culture, he wouldn't have been used to even describe James and John. But because he was, we can infer, and this we can find from historical research and things like that, that Zebedee was well known in that area, in that context, and they would have been fine to do that. And typically, if you had if your way of living for your family, because that's how they did it back then, they were so family oriented. If your way of living as a family was successful and prosperous, you don't do something else. They don't evolve.
Yep.
They just continue to do the same thing over until it doesn't work, and then that's when they would change careers. Then, okay, hey, let's go be a disciple of Jesus, and then let's go try something else.
Yeah.
For lack of a better term. But James and John, in the midst of that, I mean, it sounds like, again, they had family support, which would have been unheard of, because most of the time they would have been ridiculed. So one, this is huge to say for, more than likely, for Zebedee and for that family, of saying, man, they were like really on board with the mission of Jesus because they let him do it.
Yeah. The fact that their mom was following them around and like interacting with Jesus says a lot about where they were coming from and the kind of support that they received, because the rest of the disciples,
they had really good parents.
Yeah, almost none of the other disciples have family members mentioned, because there was a good chance their family was not supportive.
Family was not supportive.
Or they didn't have any family to speak of.
Yeah, didn't have family to speak of, or was just so stinking poor that
they couldn't leave
the
their day
idea
job.
of leaving their day job wasn't even fathomable.
Yeah.
While it was fathomable for those disciples, because again, they weren't leaving anything when Jesus says, hey, join my internship, for lack of a better term, join my discipleship, that pays nothing, eats nothing, has no place to sleep. They're like, well, I was already there. So at least you're offering me like a chance to see the world. At least you're offering me a place of prominence.
You're not offering me anything worse.
Yeah, you're offering me something, in fact, kind of better
Yeah.
than a lot of them were. James and John are the first ones to really take that big downgrade. You can say, again, when we talk about,
economically speaking.
yeah, and you could make that argument for some of the tax collectors that end up doing this as well,
Yeah,
because
that's
obviously they had but Jesus was still offering something. He was offering them social acceptance.
Yeah.
He was offering them
And spiritual acceptance.
Spiritual acceptance and a family that they were never going to have. And so James and John are really the only, in my opinion, they're the only two disciples you can look at and go, they had nothing to gain.
Yep.
They had zero to gain, and yet they still did it.
And so much to lose.
And they had more than likely, their decision most of the time would result in them completely being disowned. Family complete. They would get zero inheritance, all of those things. But it doesn't ultimately end up that way.
Yeah.
Which is a beautiful thing about how their family was on mission, not just James and John, which is beautiful. That is how it's supposed to be. But I think a lot of us, we can't really relate with James and John because it's not the case. Mm-hmm. And I feel for those people. But James and John are really good. I feel like some people go, okay, like I know, like I'm guilty of this sometimes, even of going like I had like a pretty good upbringing. Like it's not that my parents made every decision correct, because no parent's ever going to do that. But they ultimately didn't push me away from the faith. They always consistently pushed me towards Jesus. And I'm thankful for that. And they really did give me a really good launching point. And so I think sometimes in my brain I go, man, like, what position do I even have in the kingdom of God, when I look at the other disciples and I'm going, like, I wasn't outcasted. I wasn't thrown to the side. I wasn't in a place where I felt like I had to have Jesus. but it was a place where I just wanted to have Jesus. I was always brought up with Jesus, and I was given a good feet behind me. And it's good to look at James and John and go, man, but they were called the sons of thunder. Because ultimately, their passion and their zeal, regardless of their upbringing, was something that Jesus saw as important and felt important to point out. And I think there's somebody that needs to hear that maybe came from a background where they had a solid launching point, and you go, man, my testimony isn't that great. Man, I don't feel like, I never had this falling away moment. It's hard for me to relate with people sometimes. Because we got to understand is 9 times out of 10, like the disciples, these disciples, the outcasts, were relating to the people that Jesus was doing ministry with. Mm-hmm. And then you have James and John who are like, yeah, no, this isn't my people.
Yeah.
But even them ended up being such useful people in Jesus' ministry. And you can be that too, even if you did have that. I mean, Jesus uses
boring
them.
Testimony.
Yeah. I won't even say, like, I've come to the place in my Christianity that I've begun to value James and John testimonies more than I valued the other ones. And it's not, like, those ones are so important. The Peters, the people, the outcasts, the Matthews, that were far from Jesus, the prodigals that were far from Jesus and come home. Mm-hmm. But far more, I go, if Jesus has the power to attract those that have nothing, but if Jesus doesn't have the power to keep those that have something, I feel like that's a problem. Mm-hmm. And the reality is he does. He has James and John to point at. And my hope is for me, like, I can be that example too. That, you know, it's not that I'm not, like, I'm perfect, right? I'm obviously not perfect. But that ultimately, there was never this moment where I decided I'm done following Jesus, running away, going to go do my own thing. I've always been trying to get closer to Jesus. Trying to, like, there's been moments where I've doubted. There's been moments where I'm in the God, I just don't understand. But I've never said, okay, I'm done. I feel like that keeping power of Christ is such an important testimony that we get to see in James and John, where they had the solid base and they get to keep going. And that's the hope of, like, for me, you know, being a dad. Like, that's my hope for my kids. Like, I don't want to have kids that have this beautiful testimony about how they ran away from Jesus, did all these different things, and then, like, prodigals came back. Like, I don't want that to be their testimony. I value so much more that their testimony is the keeping power of Christ. And so for me, even as being in ministry now and being a pastor, I've made so much intentional effort to not just have the testimony over and over again that the kid that was running away that came back, the kid that was doing unspeakable things that decided to find Jesus, but to also put the people that have been following Jesus and can display the keeping power of Christ on the platform as well, because those voices, in my opinion, are sometimes more important than the voice of the reaching power of Christ, but actually the keeping power of Christ. And that's what I think we really get to see with James and John in comparison to the other disciples. And I think that's the big key when you understand where they came from. And you don't just read the Bible, see what happens with them, and not really understand it, but understand where they came from. Mm-hmm. That's the importance of knowing the context behind these people before you even get to this. Before you even start looking at the Word. This is important. This is absolutely crucial. Like, without this, and it doesn't mean anything.
Yes, please read your Bible.
But you can completely miss so much that's going on if you didn't understand where James and John came from, or any of these other apostles, the original 12. And so, I think it's so important. But real quick, I think we wanted to touch on kind of one more thing as James and John and kind of their playing into Stephen, correct?
Yeah. So, James and John, one more thing real quick about them before we get into Stephen. James and John and Peter were the three who consistently throughout Jesus' life and ministry are brought with him, kind of on the front lines of his ministry.
They're the inner circle.
Yeah, they're in the inner circle. They're with him a lot of times when he's praying. They're with him a lot of times when he's doing his miracles, where he doesn't let anybody else in. So there's a lot of really beautiful stories. Yep, and the Transfiguration. There's a lot of really beautiful stories where Jesus invites just those three in to see some of his most like miraculous, special moments.
It's like he's most vulnerable with them.
Yeah, and I think when you look at their stories, moving on later in the Bible, more into Acts and so on, it makes a lot of sense why he let them be so included, so deeply included in what he was doing, because they are a very, very prominent piece of the beginning of the early church, of the spreading of the gospel throughout the first century. So obviously Peter, we know, was monumental to the early church. The whole kind of first half of Acts is really focused on Peter, and then he kind of paves the way for Paul. But then even James and John, we know, obviously did monumental things for the kingdom, but James's story, it's not that he doesn't do things for the kingdom, because he does, but his story is so vastly different, because he doesn't live as long as they do. He doesn't get to do as much as they do. He's arrested with Peter several times, and some of the other apostles, but ultimately he ends up becoming one of the very first martyrs for the gospel. And so this is where his story kind of overlaps with Stephen a little bit. So Stephen, if you're not familiar, he was the first martyr for the gospel of Jesus. He's very well known among the Christian faith. Yeah, he's infamous for his zeal and his passion for the gospel. But in reality, when you read the scriptures, he's actually written about very, very, very little. So he's introduced in Acts chapter 6, and that chapter is only 15 verses total. So it's very short and to the point. The first half of the chapter, Acts chapter 6, is we get this complaint from some of the Hellenistic Jews that the widows have been overlooked in like a daily, kind of food, soup kitchen kind of situation. And so the apostles are like, oh crap, like you're right, we should definitely be taking care of that. And so they appoint these 7 other apostles to basically be in charge of taking care of the widows. And one of them is Stephen. And that's the first half of Acts chapter 6. And then the second half of Acts chapter 6, Stephen is immediately seized and brought before the council, which includes like the Sadducees. And so then we get into Acts chapter 7, and he delivers this long sermon. And then he gets to the end of his sermon, and he immediately is murdered. He's killed by death by stoning. And there we have an introduction to Paul, because it says the people who threw the stones at Stephen laid their coats at the feet of Saul. And then verse 1 of chapter 8 says that Saul actually approved his execution. And then after that, literally immediately after the execution of Stephen, this prompted a widespread persecution of the church. So this is now where we move back into kind of Peter, James, and John's stories. And it's pretty quick after Stephen is executed that we get to the execution of James. So Stephen is stoned in Acts chapter 7, and then just a few chapters later in Acts 12, it says King Herod, actually, not even just the Jewish rulers, religious leaders anymore at this point. It's now the king is getting involved. King Herod has James executed with the sword, and then he puts Peter back into prison again. So it's just a wild roller coaster of a ride from kind of those middle chapters of the book of Acts, where you get You go from all the disciples and all the apostles just being so excited after, the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. They're excited. They're on fire for Jesus. They're ready to spread the gospel and evangelize. And then immediately Stephen gets stoned, and then there's just this mass persecution of Christians, and they all kind of lose a lot of hope. It says a lot of them kind of went into hiding. They got really terrified. But yeah, then their story goes on from there.
Stephen is literally on 2 pages in my Bible. He has 2 full pages. That's it. He shows up and dies just as quick as he showed up.
Yep.
The only reason why he even gets 2 pages instead of like a half page is because he is the type of guy where if you draft him last in the get to the buffet first draft. Like if you're picking your preacher for Sunday morning, like you're drafting and your goal is to beat the Baptist to the buffet, like you draft him last.
I mean,
like,
can you
for
blame
sure,
him though? Like, you're gonna die. Like,
He's
you are in front of
stalling.
these people who hate you so much and everything that you stand for, and you're like, the only thing keeping me alive right now is my mouth.
He would be really good at what is that called when you like stall in politics? Filibuster.
Oh yes.
He'd be really good at filibustering.
Leslie Knope would recruit Stephen.
Oh man. Don't get into Parks and Rec. You're gonna get us canceled.
Sorry. We'll edit that out.
Oh, whatever, we won't. Was it Stephen? So either way, all that to say, being a martyr for the faith was a big deal, and James ends up being that a little bit quicker than some of the other ones. Some of the other original 12 apostles. I keep saying apostles. Because, I mean, they were disciples and apostles.
Yeah.
So, apostles.
The words are almost interchangeable.
I'm going to make that a shirt.
Not really.
Apostles. But, regardless, that's James and John.
Nothing is...
No, that's James and John.
Nothing is
No, nothing is possible. Okay. Well, next episode, we'll get into a little bit more, some more of the apostles, whatever you want to call them. And nothing is possible. See you on the next one.